All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive. Today, we're going on a quest for evidence. And not just any evidence. Oh no, we're talking about clues pointing towards a global flood that totally changed our planet.
We're talking about floods so big it reshaped the Earth.
You got it. And to guide us on this adventure, we've got excerpts from A Flood of Evidence by Ken Ham and Boddy Hodge. These guys bring in everything, biblical accounts, historical legend.
They even dive into some scientific arguments that'll probably surprise you. It's pretty cool.
So, are you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so from what I've read so far, it seems like the authors start by posing a central mystery, right?
Yeah, they frame it like a detective story, which is pretty fun. They basically ask, how old is the Earth? And did a global flood really happen?
I'm guessing they don't think those are two separate questions.
You got it. They argue that if you accept the idea of an Earth that's millions of years old, that pretty much shuts the door on the possibility of a worldwide flood.
So it's kind of like a fork in the road. You go down one path, you end up with an old Earth, no flood. You go down the other path.
You get a young Earth and a massive flood that shaped everything. They're really laying out two totally different ways of looking at Earth's history.
Two completely different timelines. On one hand, you've got the scientific view of an Earth that's, what, 4.5 billion years old? Something like that.
Yeah, billions of years. That's the prevailing view. But then you've got this book presenting a completely different timeline, one shaped by a massive global flood.
It's a huge difference in perspective.
For sure. And to make their case, the authors start with the Bible.
Makes sense, considering the title of the book.
Right. They take us straight to the book of Genesis, to those passages that describe the flood. And they're not talking about just a little local flood, but a worldwide deluge.
A flood that covered everything. I'm thinking of Genesis 7, verses 17 through 23, I think.
You got it. That's where it talks about the waters covering all the high mountains, even rising 15 cubits higher than the mountains themselves.
15 cubits? That's what, like 22 feet?
Something like that.
Yeah.
We're talking serious flooding here.
It's hard to even imagine. But okay, besides the Bible, is there anything else that backs up this idea of a global flood?
Now, this is where it gets interesting. The book talks about all these flood legends, stories about a massive flood that pop up in cultures all over the world.
Really? Like worldwide?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And here's the crazy part. These legends, even though they come from different places and different times, they all share some common elements.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, there's the Babylonian story of Utnapishtim. Have you heard of that one?
Rings a bell, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
It's a great story. Basically, this guy, Utnapishtim, he gets a heads up from the god Ea. Ea tells him that this huge flood is going to wipe out the world.
So Utnapishtim gets this divine warning. What does he do?
He builds a giant boat, of course, to save himself and a bunch of animals.
Sounds a little familiar, like a certain arc we've heard of.
Right. It's pretty striking how similar the stories are. Yeah. And that's just one example. The Hawaiians have a legend about a guy named Nu. He's the only righteous dude left, and he builds a canoe to survive a global deluge.
Another righteous dude with a boat? I'm sensing a pattern here.
It's wild, isn't it? And there's even a Tanzanian tale where a god tells these two people to build a massive boat and gather all kinds of animals.
Why?
Because, you guessed it, a flood's coming to cover the mountains. It's like a global game of telephone, but with a super serious message.
A game of telephone across continents. It makes you wonder if these stories are all based on some actual historical event.
That's the big question, isn't it?
But okay, let's be real for a second. When most people think about the flood, they think about Noah's Ark. Does the book address that at all?
Oh yeah, they go all in on Noah's Ark. They treat it as a completely historical reality, and they tackle one of the biggest questions people have head on.
What's that?
The size of the thing. I mean, the Bible gives pretty specific dimensions.
It says the ark was, what, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high.
Yep, that's right. That translates to roughly 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high.
That's massive.
Yeah.
I mean, were people even capable of building something that colossal back then?
It's a fair question. But you might be surprised to learn that the ark's size isn't as far-fetched as it seems. The book argues that shipbuilding techniques back then were way more advanced than we give them credit for.
Really? They had some serious boat building skills.
They did. They even cite examples like mortise and tenon shipbuilding, used by the Greeks and Romans. This suggests that even more sophisticated knowledge could have been passed down from pre-flood times.
Wow, so they're saying people back then weren't just slapping logs together and hoping for the best.
Exactly. But they also entertain another pretty intriguing idea, that maybe God gave Noah some specific instructions. just like he did with the tabernacle.
So maybe Noah had some divine blueprints to work with.
It's a possibility. But okay, we've got these biblical accounts, these fascinating flood legends from all over the world. We've even got this potentially massive boat.
Right, but where's the hard scientific evidence? Do rocks and fossils really back up this story?
That's where the real detective work starts. The book argues that the evidence is literally etched into the earth itself. It all comes down to how you interpret how geological formations happen.
Like mountains and canyons and stuff.
Exactly. And there are two totally different schools of thought when it comes to understanding how those things formed.
All right, lay it on me. What are these two competing theories?
On one side, you've got what's called catastrophism, that basically acknowledges that catastrophic events in the past have shaped the Earth's surface. We're talking about massive floods, huge volcanic eruptions, things like that.
So they're not talking about slow and steady changes over millions of years.
Nope. Catastrophism says that big, sudden events played a major role in shaping our planet. And on the other side, you've got uniformitarianism. That's the idea that everything we see today, all the mountains, canyons, all of it, was formed by slow, gradual processes over millions and millions of years.
Okay, so slow and steady wins the race versus big and sudden, right?
You got it. And it's probably no surprise that the book, A Flood of Evidence, is firmly in the catastrophism camp.
Right. They're arguing for a global flood, so those slow and steady processes don't really fit their narrative.
Exactly. And to illustrate their point, they use some pretty cool real-world examples. Like, have you ever seen the Grand Canyon?
Who hasn't? It's massive.
It's incredible, right? And while there are different theories about exactly when it formed, pretty much everyone agrees that it originated from some kind of catastrophic event.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine anything but a major catastrophe carving out something that immense.
It's mind-boggling. And to drive their point home, the book also talks about the rapid formation of other canyons. Canyons like Providence Canyon in Georgia and Burlingame Canyon in Washington.
And these canyons formed quickly.
Relatively speaking, yes. They formed in a much shorter amount of time than you'd expect if you believed in those slow and steady processes over millions of years.
So they're using these examples of rapid change to challenge the idea that all geological formations take eons to develop.
Exactly. They even bring up the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. Remember that one?
Vaguely.
It was a huge eruption, and it laid down these thick layers of sediment in just a few hours. It was crazy.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
It really is. And the book uses that eruption as an example of how quickly geological formations can actually occur.
It's amazing how a single event like that can completely reshape a landscape.
Right. And the book argues that the same principle applies to the flood. They're saying that a global flood could have caused these massive, rapid changes to the Earth's surface that we see evidence of today.
That's pretty wild. It really makes you question those timelines we often see in textbooks.
It's definitely a different way of looking at things. And speaking of looking at things differently, they also talk about how fossils form.
Oh yeah, fossils. Those are always cool to look at in museums.
Right. But have you ever stopped to think about how they actually form? Like, how do those dinosaur bones end up preserved in rock?
I've always just kind of assumed it's this really slow process, things getting buried over millions of years.
It's a common assumption, but the book challenges that whole idea. They argue that fossils actually form through rapid burial.
Rapid burial.
Yeah, things have to get buried really quickly to become fossils. Otherwise, they would just decay and disappear.
Oh, that makes sense. I never thought about it like that before.
It's all about cutting off the oxygen and preventing decomposition. And the book uses some really vivid examples to back this up. Like, for example, they talk about fossilized jellyfish.
Jellyfish. Really?
Yep. Jellyfish are super delicate. Their bodies are mostly water. So for them to be preserved as fossils, they would have had to be buried almost instantly.
Yeah, I can't imagine a jellyfish fossil forming slowly over millions of years.
Right. It just doesn't make sense. And they also talk about petrified wood, which is basically wood that's turned to stone.
I've seen that stuff. It's amazing how the wood grain is still visible.
It's really cool. And the book mentions that petrified wood has been observed forming super rapidly, both in laboratory settings and in nature.
Really? So it doesn't necessarily take millions of years?
Nope. The book argues that it can happen much faster than we might think. And again, this challenges the whole millions of years narrative.
Wow, this is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about fossils.
It's all about looking at the evidence through a different lens, right?
Yeah, definitely. But speaking of evidence, I'm curious about how the book addresses radiometric dating methods. Because, Those seem like pretty strong evidence for an old Earth.
You're talking about things like carbon dating.
Yeah, exactly. Those methods seem to suggest that the Earth is billions of years old. How does the book reconcile that with their flood narrative?
It's a good question. And while the book acknowledges that those methods are often presented as proof of an old Earth, they also point out that those methods rely on some pretty big assumptions.
What kind of assumptions are we talking about?
Well, they operate on the principle of uniformitarianism. Remember that idea we talked about earlier?
The slow and steady processes over millions of years.
That's the one. So these dating methods assume that things like radioactive decay have always happened at the same constant rate over billions of years. But the book challenges those assumptions.
So they're not saying the science itself is wrong, but maybe the way it's being interpreted could be flawed.
That's one way to put it. They highlight the fact that different radiometric dating methods sometimes give you totally different ages for the same sample, which is a little fishy.
Yeah, that does seem a little suspicious. Like, if these methods are so reliable, shouldn't they all give you the same answer?
You would think so. And then there's carbon-14 dating, which is a method typically used to date things within a range of thousands of years, not millions.
Right. Carbon-14 dating is used for more recent stuff, like archaeological artifacts.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The book points out that scientists have found carbon-14 in things like coal and diamonds.
Coal and diamonds.
Yep. And those materials are conventionally thought to be millions, even billions of years old.
So what's the problem with finding carbon-14 in those things?
Well, if they were really that ancient, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left in them. It would have all decayed away by now.
Oh, I see. So that discovery kind of throws a wrench into the whole millions of years timeline.
It definitely raises some questions, and the book uses that as evidence to support their argument that maybe these dating methods aren't as reliable as we've been led to believe.
That's fascinating. It's like the more we dig into this, the more complicated it gets.
It's definitely a complex topic with lots of different perspectives. But the book doesn't just focus on the scientific aspects of the flood. They also delve into some pretty profound theological implications.
Okay, let's talk theology. What kind of theological issues does the book raise?
Well, one of the big ones is the concept of death before sin.
Ah, that's a classic theological debate. You're talking about whether or not death existed before Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden.
Right, exactly. And if you accept the idea of an old Earth, an Earth that's billions of years old, then you're pretty much forced to accept the idea that death existed long before humans even showed up.
Because there would have been all those dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures dying and going extinct for millions of years.
Exactly. But the book argues that this idea of death before sin creates a real problem theologically, because the Bible seems pretty clear that death entered the world as a result of sin. Remember those passages we mentioned earlier, Romans 5.2 and 1 Corinthians 15.21-22?
Yeah, the ones about death coming through sin.
Those are the ones. And the book leans heavily on those passages. They argue that the Bible clearly teaches that death and suffering weren't part of God's original creation. Death wasn't part of the plan. It was a consequence of Adam's sin.
Okay, so if death existed for millions of years before humans even came along, that kind of contradicts what the Bible says about the origin of death.
Right, and it raises some tough questions, like if death and suffering were already part of God's very good creation, as Genesis says, what does that say about God's character?
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile those two ideas. A good God who creates a world filled with death and suffering.
Exactly. It's a real dilemma. And the book proposes that the flood actually provides a framework for understanding this apparent contradiction.
The flood helps explain the death before sin problem.
In a way, yes. If all those fossils we see today are largely a result of this global flood, then all that death and suffering didn't happen before sin. It happened after.
Ah, so it's like a dividing line. Before the flood, no death. After the flood, death enters the picture.
That's one way to look at it. And by framing it this way, the book manages to reconcile those scientific observations with a literal interpretation of the biblical account.
It's definitely a different perspective than what we usually hear. It's like they're challenging the entire evolutionary paradigm.
They are. And they're offering a completely different narrative to explain the evidence, a narrative that starts with a global flood.
It's a pretty bold approach, but I have to admit it's intriguing. It makes you think about things in a whole new way.
It's a real mind-bender. But we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover in a flood of evidence.
Well, I'm definitely ready for more. I'm hooked on this whole flood investigation now. Bring on the evidence.
All right, let's do it. We'll pick up right where we left off in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, we're back, and man, there's so much to unpack from those excerpts. We were talking about those millions of years arguments and how a flood of evidence tackles those. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. They really challenge some core assumptions about how we understand time, don't they?
They do. Like, remember that whole thing about carbon-14 dating and how they found carbon-14 in coal and diamonds?
Yeah, that's a tough one to explain if you're sticking to that old Earth timeline.
It really throws a wrench in things.
It does. And the authors don't stop there. They also go after some other big examples people use to support the idea of an ancient Earth.
Like what? Give me some more examples. I'm ready for round two.
Okay, well, remember those ice cores?
You mean the ones they drill out of glaciers? Yeah, those are pretty cool.
Yeah, those long tubes of ice.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists study those to figure out what the climate was like way back when.
Right, because each layer of ice represents a year, and some of those ice cores have thousands of layers.
Exactly. And that's how they get those timelines that stretch back thousands of years. But the book argues that those layers don't always tell the whole story.
Wait, really? What do you mean?
Well, they point out that those layers in the ice cores can actually form a lot faster than we might think. Like, way faster.
So they're saying those thousands of layers might not actually represent thousands of years.
They're saying it's possible, yeah. In fact, they even cite research suggesting that the whole Greenland ice sheet could have formed in less than 1,000 years.
1,000 years? That's way shorter than what scientists usually say.
Right. It's a big difference. And this research links that rapid ice sheet formation to a major flood event.
So they're connecting it back to the flood again.
Exactly. It all ties back to their central argument. And they apply a similar kind of thinking to those ancient bristlecone pines.
Oh yeah, those trees that can live for thousands of years. Those things are insane.
They're amazing, aren't they?
Yeah.
But the book questions this assumption that each ring in a bristlecone pine represents exactly 1 year of growth.
Wait, so those rings don't always line up perfectly with years?
Not necessarily, no. See, multiple rings can actually form within a single year, especially if the growing conditions are kind of wonky.
So you're saying those bristlecone pines might not actually be as old as we think?
It's a possibility. The book highlights this point. And get this, they even challenge the way we date coral reefs.
Coral reefs? I never even thought about those in the context of this whole age of the Earth thing.
It's not something you hear about every day, is it? But coral reefs are often used as evidence for an old Earth, because people say they take millions of years to grow.
Okay, but I'm guessing the book has a different take on that.
You bet. They argue that coral reefs can actually grow way faster than we think, especially if the conditions are just right.
So what do they propose cause these ideal conditions for rapid coral growth? Let me guess.
The flood.
Of course.
Right. It always comes back to the flood. They're basically suggesting that the flood could have created a sort of turbocharged environment for coral reef development.
Man, it's like they're taking all these pieces of the puzzle and putting them together in a completely different way.
It's a different perspective for sure. They're taking all this scientific data and filtering it through the lens of a global flood. And it leads them into some fascinating theological territory, too.
Okay, let's talk about the theology. We were talking about that death before sin problem earlier.
Yeah, remember those key passages in Romans and 1 Corinthians?
The ones about death coming into the world through sin.
Those are the ones. And the book really leans into those. They argue that the Bible's super clear that death and suffering weren't part of God's original creation.
Yeah, it always seemed kind of weird to me that a loving God would create a world filled with so much death and suffering, you know?
It's a tough concept to wrap your head around, for sure.
Yeah.
But the book suggests that accepting the idea of millions of years of death before sin creates a real theological problem, because it means death was always part of God's plan.
And that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
It is. And the book argues that the flood actually offers a different way to understand this. If all those fossils we see are mostly from the flood, then all that death and suffering didn't happen before sin entered the world.
It happened after, right? So the flood is like this dividing line.
Exactly. Before the flood, no death. After the flood, death becomes a reality.
It's like a reset button on the whole death and suffering thing.
In a way, yeah. And by understanding it this way, the book tries to bring together the scientific evidence with a literal interpretation of the Bible.
It's like they're offering an alternative narrative to the one we usually hear.
That's exactly what they're doing. And whether you agree with their conclusions or not, it definitely makes you think about things differently.
It does. It's challenging and thought-provoking, and I have to say, I'm really digging this whole exploration.
Me too. It's fascinating to see how they connect the flood to so many different aspects of our understanding of the world, from science to theology. But before we wrap up, I have a question. If this flood really happened, what happened next? Like, how did humanity pick up the pieces and start over after something so catastrophic?
That's a great question. Like, where do you even begin to rebuild after something like that?
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And that's something we're going to dive into in part 3 when we explore the aftermath of the flood and how it might have shaped the course of human history.
Okay, now I'm really on the edge of my seat. Let's get to part 3. Okay, we're back for the final part of our deep dive, and I'm ready to tackle that last question. If this flood was as huge and catastrophic as the book makes it out to be, what happened next? Like, how did humanity even begin to rebuild after something that devastating?
That's where things get really interesting. Because the book connects the flood not just to geology and fossils, but to the entire story of human civilization.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. How do they make that connection?
Well, they argue that the flood is the key to understanding how humanity spread out across the globe. Think about it. If the whole world was reshaped by this massive flood, it would have been a total reset for everyone.
Yeah, like starting from scratch, literally.
Exactly. And Noah's descendants wouldn't have just stayed put in one place after the waters receded. They would started migrating, spreading out to different parts of the world, forming new groups.
So they're suggesting that all the different cultures and people groups we see today might actually trace their roots back to this post-flood migration.
That's the idea. And it explains why we see so many similarities between different cultures, even ones that are separated by huge distances.
You mean like those flood legends we were talking about earlier?
Exactly. Those legends could be echoes of a shared history, like a memory that was passed down through generations from a time when humanity was actually united in the aftermath of this global catastrophe.
It's like the flood is this common thread that connects us all despite all our differences. That's pretty powerful. But okay, let's say I buy into this whole flood narrative. What does it mean for me today? Like, why should I care about something that happened thousands of years ago?
That's a great question, and while the book doesn't give you a step-by-step guide to applying flood lessons to modern life, it does leave you with some pretty profound things to think about.
Okay, give me those profound things to think about. What are the big takeaways here?
Well, for starters, it makes you reconsider your place in history. It reminds you that the Earth has this long, vast story that stretches way beyond our limited human perspective.
I like that. It's like zooming out and seeing the big picture, realizing we're just a tiny part of this huge unfolding narrative.
That's exactly it. And by understanding the past, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the present, for all those forces that have shaped the world we live in.
So it's not just about memorizing dates and facts. It's about connecting with the story of our planet.
Exactly. And there's another important takeaway that ties into our discussion about death and suffering.
The death before sin dilemma.
That's the one. If the flood really did happen, it's a powerful reminder of just how serious sin is and the need for redemption.
I never thought about it like that before.
It's like the flood becomes a physical manifestation of the brokenness that sin brought into the world.
It's heavy stuff for sure.
It is. But it also points us toward the hope we have in Christ, the one who overcame death and offers us a way to be reconciled with God.
So even though it's a story about destruction and devastation, it ultimately offers a message of hope.
It's all about perspective. And a flood of evidence definitely gives you a new perspective on this ancient story and how it shapes our understanding of the world.
Well, I've got to say, this deep dive has been a wild ride. We've explored the Bible, those global flood legends, and some pretty intense scientific and theological arguments.
A lot to take in.
It is. And it's definitely challenged me to think outside the box, to consider a different narrative than the one I'm used to hearing.
That's the great thing about knowledge, isn't it? It pushes us to question our assumptions and explore new ideas.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has inspired you, dear listener, to explore this topic further. Maybe you'll even grab a copy of A Flood of Evidence and see what you uncover.
It's a fascinating read, that's for sure.
It is. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of our world. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.